Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you, June Casey. Thank you, Caitlin Laughlin, for helping to organize all of this today. Thank you all for coming out. Perhaps it speaks to the hunger to witness people, one, admitting they might have been wrong about something, and two, changing their mind to a new view that you are all here. It also just might be that there's food. But whatever your reason for coming out here today, we're so pleased to see you and to have a chance to hear at least 4 instances in which our respective guests had a chance to change their mind about something, and then see what linkage, if any, we might find among them. So to get us started, I'm hoping to call upon Larry Tribe, who has been extremely, you have so many views, so well known. This is kind of your tagline or something. But I understand you're coming out guns blazing with a view that has evolved, changed. Even here, I'm euphemizing. You have changed your mind about the Second Amendment. Yes. So, Larry, if you just want to say a few words about it, and we'll go down. Yes?
And is this already turned on?
I will check. Let's see. No, it is. There we are. Okay.
Non-technological. Okay.
You are good to go.
So for about 20 years, 25 years, I used to write that, of course, the Second Amendment really had no application in modern society. We no longer had militias. It had nothing to do with an individual right. And then as I looked more deeply into it, I knew that I hated gun violence. I knew that as a policy matter, I was in favor of overwhelming gun control, wouldn't even mind having all guns confiscated. Although the fear of many people that that's what would happen is a fear that, for better or worse, I think probably for better, was to some extent offset by giving the Second Amendment some new life. Anyway, around 2000, I studied it more closely, and I decided that although the right to possess firearms was one that under the Constitution could be regulated very closely. I mean, nothing that could possibly pass politically would flunk under the Second Amendment. But I did conclude, after lots of hand-wringing and research and thought, that it did protect some kind of individual right. And I concluded that partly because I looked at the 14th Amendment, and I do a lot of time travel. That is, I look at how later parts of the Constitution shed light on earlier parts. And the history of the 14th Amendment pretty clearly showed that among the privileges of citizens that ought to belong to the formerly enslaved was the right or the privilege to protect themselves with firearms when the police wouldn't protect them or in fact would cooperate with lynching them. And I read that back into the Second Amendment, and it turns out that in the McDonald case in 2010, that's sort of the way the Supreme Court approached it. That is, this is not an originalist view. It's a view that takes account of evolving history, and the idea that that one of our basic liberties is the liberty to defend ourselves, and in fact to defend ourselves with lethal force in certain circumstances, is a view that emerged and became kind of solidified in the Constitution. And as soon as I changed my mind, there was a story in the New York Times, and Charlton Heston, who was then the head of the NRA, calls me up and says, "I see you're now one of us." I said, no, I admired you in Moses, I think it was, but I'm not one of you. I'm in favor of very tight regulation, and he never called back. Anyway, that's a vignette of my change on the Second Amendment.
So just 2 quick questions. One, it's striking to me that you didn't mention when you changed your mind. Was it before or after the Supreme Court changed?
Before. It was 1998-9 as I was writing the 3rd edition of my treatise, and it was in the 2000 edition, which has only one volume. The other volume I decided never to finish.
You quite famously announced that it was impossible to do con law treatises anymore.
Well, that was the main reason, but in fact, I changed my mind, and then it was actually Sandy Levinson, I think, who spurred the revival of this right, and then I was part of that little movement, and most of my friends thought I was crazy and still think that the Second Amendment should be read out of the Constitution. I wouldn't mind repealing it, but that's a different matter.
Yes. And the second thing not mentioned is how this came about. You mentioned that you kind of re-noticed the 14th Amendment, but
Well, no, I'd never failed to notice the 14th.
I was
But it was the
I was
history
being
of,
playful.
it was the part of the 14th Amendment history that talked about the importance of arming people who were oppressed or otherwise marginalized,
Yes.
and letting them have arms.
And was that a primary source that you beheld when you were reading in the history of the 14th Amendment, or was there sort of a eureka moment when you were like, this changes everything?
It was not quite eureka because it came on me a little bit more slowly. I read a lot of things. I sort of thought, I mean, part of what I was doing was those things I believed that were very widely taken as conventional wisdom. I wanted to carefully rethink each of those because I thought it was so likely that what I believed was overwhelmingly affected by sort of the atmosphere around me on the subject. So I re-examined lots of things, like the laws about prior restraint and various aspects of separation of powers. And this was one of the things that I re-examined that I thought I really can't stick with the old view. So I wrote this, I think, 8,000-word footnote in the 2000 edition of my treatise, a huge footnote taking a kind of nuanced view of the
At some
Second
point,
Amendment.
isn't it like, maybe this should be in the main text?
Yeah, oh, right. Or an article or something, yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you, Larry, for setting the stage.
Thanks, John.
Jill Lepore, the Kemper Professor of American History at Harvard and of equal or greater moment, staff writer for The New Yorker. Tell us about your
Yeah,
game.
the changing of my mind did not warrant coverage in the New York Times. I'm here to model changing of mind about something that seems to be of no consequence, but that is a matter of kind of private integrity. So this is more in the manner of true confessions. I wrote a history of the United States a few years back, and I was looking out for places where I was making assumptions about things that had happened and interpretations that were just really received wisdom to me in order to force myself to go back to the primary sources and genuinely evaluate the material. And so when I got to the Scopes trial in 1925, the trial of John Scopes for the teaching of evolution in violation of law, it passed in Tennessee, I knew that I knew everything that I knew about the Scopes trial from watching Inherit the Wind, the 1960 movie with Spencer Tracy.
That documentary, that was great.
Yeah, that documentary,
Yeah.
based on a play written in 1955 that mobilizes the story of the Scopes trial as part of an effort to take down McCarthy. I'm sad to say Spencer Tracy didn't call me after I changed my mind about his depiction of Clarence Darrow. But when I went back and actually read about Bryan, so Bryan is also much mocked in historical scholarship, it's generally by liberal scholars, kind of beginning with Richard Hofstadter. Everybody thought William Jennings Bryan, who was known as Mr. Fundamentalist, was essentially an idiot. Clarence Darrow famously called him the idol of all morondom. He's really skewered by H.L. Mencken during the Scopes trial in particular. Eugene Debs, the socialist, called him a prophet of the Stone Age. He's ridiculed by his contemporaries and by historians as having been kind of a dupe and essentially an intellectual fraud. But if you actually, I grew very suspicious of that portrayal of Bryan, who was nothing if not sincere in his embrace of the common people. He was a populist who brought together the People's Party and the Democratic Party in the election of 1896. And he had the misfortune to die immediately after the Scopes trial, 5 days later after the strain of a heart attack in his bed. So could never defend himself from the depiction of how he had waged the defense, the prosecution on behalf of the state of Tennessee in that trial. But I was really compelled by this essay that, by a lot of stuff about Bryan, including a great biography by Michael Kazin called The Godly Hero. But taking Bryan in his own words, he wrote this essay in 1921 called The Menace of Darwinism, in which it became really clear to me that to the degree that Bryan was an unsettled thinker, he did not distinguish between Darwinism as a scientific theory and social Darwinism as a political practice. And when he attacked Darwinism, he was attacking social Darwinism. He was an advocate of the poor. And in this essay, he says, we would never have passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. It's like we would never have passed most progressive legislation if people really believed Darwinism and that the poor should be left to die off. That those who do not thrive should be allowed to die off. That the survival of the fittest argument of social Darwinism was what he was arguing against. And he looked at a state like Tennessee, where the public schools were teaching poor kids who had been poor whose families had been poor for generations, and said, how will these kids know that they can thrive if they are taught Darwinism? And for me, that was a really powerful way to think about what Brian's project was and what the state of Tennessee was actually motivated by, which absolutely included religious fundamentalism, but really included a progressive social vision that had been Clarence Darrow's vision. Darrow, the famous defense attorney who went to defend John Scopes in this show trial. And there's a line from that Brian piece, The Menace of Darwinism, that I really loved, where he's sort of indicting the kind of hubris of modernism against tradition and indicting really men of science, but what he means really is more, again, the Herbert Spencer sort of social Darwinism. He said, men who would not cross the street to save a soul have traveled across the world in search of skeletons. That there's just something about that gesture of scientific research in the abstract that fails to attend to the suffering of people left behind by modernity that I just found incredibly powerful. And so I changed my mind about the Scopes trial.
Fascinating. And fascinating to see you then sort of describe him as having elements of both a progressive and a conservative. To the extent that these labels mean anything, it sounds like it was conservatism for the purpose of minding the poor.
Yeah, although those labels don't map on perfectly well. You know, when FDR was running in 1932, Herbert Hoover said, look, the guy is just Bryanism warmed over with a new label. And that is true. Like, Bryanism does found what becomes the New Deal, right? It is an objection. Yeah. It just has, he has a different objection to the power of the state.
There's going to be so many candidates in the 2020 American election. I wonder if one of them will be Bryanism warmed over will be their campaign motto.
Hey,
really
look, I mean, he looks a lot better than any of these people. I'm just saying.
Last question before moving right along.
Yeah, we have guns too on the table. So what else?
One of the things you're pointing out about Brian was that he was willing to subordinate truth to a noble end, subordinate it, which is to say there's stuff that shouldn't be taught because if people learn it, whether it's true or not, suppose it is true, they'll act poorly. They'll learn about regular Darwinism, evolutionary Darwinism, and they'll become social Darwinists, which is bad. And I understand descriptively that might be what you're saying. I'm curious if you think generally, as a teacher, are there any truths so volatile, so incendiary that they shouldn't be taught?
So in the end, I'd side with Darrow. You know, like, I don't actually side with Brian in the Scopes trial. Like, knowledge cannot be too dangerous to be shared. I just believe that in all kinds of ways, and not least among them as a teacher. But Walter Lippmann, who was the greatest political commentator of the day, who wasn't able to go to Dayton, Tennessee for the trial because his wife was really ill and he was a good person and stayed home, wrote this incredible essay about the trial called American Inquisitors, in which he asked that question. And he did it by imagining that, that after Brian died, because he had just died, that he met Thomas Jefferson and Socrates in heaven. And Socrates had Jefferson and Brian have a debate. And the debate was, if we believe in majority rule, but you also believe in religious freedom and the freedom of ideas, then how can the state of Tennessee declare that something can't be known? Right, that there's an essential conflict. Like, you can decree something as outside the realm of ideas by popular rule. And that is, of course, where we are today. So it's actually really powerful to think about Lippmann. He can't even find a way to address this except in a thought experiment in 1928 when he writes American Inquisitors.
Got it. Thank you. Sounds like also a possibly great movie of that meeting in heaven. I don't know who Spencer Tracy would play in that group. But Kendra Albert, clinician at our cyber law clinic at Harvard Law School. So many ways to introduce you, given the work you've done both here and for digital rights, thinking about digital platforms. Tell us about changing your mind.
Sure, I thought I was going last, so.
Well, you still could. I changed my mind. I'm sorry. Set that one up, didn't we?
Yeah, if that joke only gets made once, I'll be disappointed in all of us. So I think my story may be a little bit different, and I was nervous, so I wrote it down in advance. I changed my mind about bringing baked goods into the office twice. Before 2012, I don't remember having an opinion on this complex and important topic. But I do remember that in 2012, I brought cookies in for a meeting. I was nominally in charge of a large group of folks, and I figured as a courtesy, I would bake some cookies to make everyone feel better about having to attend on less than 24 hours notice. They were Christina Tosi's chocolate chip marshmallow cornflake cookies, better than the version they sell in Harvard Square. During the meeting, I found myself overanalyzing how many people had eaten them, who went back for seconds, if they liked them. And as the cookies disappeared, I felt as if my authority to actually lead the meeting was disintegrating, crumbling into the carpet along with the stray crumbs.
Because they were eating the cookies?
Yeah.
Wow.
They were delicious. I swore never again. No more baked goods in the office. To be fair, it wasn't a totally unreasonable position. I haven't been able to track down a citation, and but I had a student tell me last semester that Sheryl Sandberg once said you should never bring baked goods into the office. The unspoken end of that sentence is, if you're a woman. You should never bring baked goods into the office if you're a woman or you're read as one, because then you'll be a mom rather than a leader. Obviously, those two things are not mutually exclusive. A nurturer rather than a respected colleague. And if you had to choose, and it certainly did seem like you had to choose, wouldn't you pick respected over comforting? I would. I did. Besides, opting out of feminine labor as a feminine presenting person felt radical. It felt transgressive. It wasn't just that I had brought cookies into the office, it was that I cared what people thought about them. Baking cookies shows that you spent time and energy on taking care of others, a no-no. But desperately wanting people to like your baked goods is even worse. Caring about what other people think gives them power over you, and giving people who have to respect you power over you is scary. But I changed my mind again. That changing my mind about the no baked goods policy wasn't a bolt from the blue. I don't know what specific meeting it happened in or what cookies it went along with. I didn't wake up one morning and shout, the patriarchy is full of lies. Good leaders can be vulnerable and show that they care. And bake a whole pan of brownies for my colleagues. It was a slow process, much like sugar caramelizing on the Great British Bake Off, where nothing appears to be changing until the entire pan is almost burnt and someone desperately pulls it off the stove. When I took a class from a biological anthropologist who was amazing, who baked for us, her students every week, I found that I didn't respect her any less. When I read Teaching to Transgress and Bell Hooks talked about the importance of being vulnerable and present in order to create a learning environment, I found myself nodding along. I thought about how many more risks I was willing to take with colleagues who were open about their struggles and uncertainty. I followed a long conversation online around emotional labor and reflected upon how much I love the feminist spaces where people put time, energy, and attention into creating dialogue. Over time, I watched who had the option of opting out: race, age, hierarchical position, and of course gender, informing whether people were able to opt out of vulnerability and care work. I felt uncomfortable opting out just because I could. In short, I found 1,000 counterexamples to my initial thesis that there was a transgressive power to opting out. Care work, baking, is radical. In a society where vulnerability and care are devalued and seen as signs of weakness, sometimes it is more transgressive to opt in. I guess, my conclusion was that vulnerability and visible care are not at odds with leadership and respect. I now believe that they are inseparable, that admitting that you care, that you're willing to put in the time and energy is fundamental to showing those around you respect. I think if I paused here, Jonathan would ask me the next question, which is like, were you wrong then?
That sounds like a good question. You might as well answer it.
So I'll just answer it. The fundamental question of changing your mind is what if you changed or if the world did. Was I right in 2012 that I was respected less because I baked for people? Does my confidence now come from the sense that I am more sure I'm better at my job, more sure that I'm worthy of respect, or that I'm a better baker? Hard to know. I am a better baker. But one way out of the trap of patriarchy, where you are damned if you do and damned if you don't, is to do what you would have wanted to do anyway. So now I bake.
Thank you for your vulnerability and presence in telling that tale. Have you told that before?
Yes. When I was discussing with someone whether I should talk about it here.
Yeah.
But other than public.
Thank you for protecting my anonymity. Yes, we did talk about that.
I actually wasn't talking about you.
Oh, so maybe this is becoming a cross-examination despite all of my best intentions. Fascinating. And fascinating, too, because so far, at least, it sounds as if the changed minds are coming about, whether on substance or process or presentation, largely through self-reflection, with maybe some external stimulus for each that got the self-reflection going, such as the class you were taking, or a conversation maybe with Sandy Levinson, or encountering some papers, some documents, some descriptions that maybe hadn't made it into the movie, in your case, Jill. Jeannie, we should turn to you now. Jeannie Suk, longtime professor at Harvard Law School.
It's really been a long time.
It's been a long time. I don't. Sorry to be the one to tell you, but with a portfolio so broad and kaleidoscopic that it defies description. When I say many possible things you could be changing your mind about, it's not a description of how solid your previous scholarship is, but rather just how many topics there are.
Yes. So for this, you're right that there were many things I considered talking about, but the one that I ultimately landed on is a topic that has been a preoccupation of mine since I was 18 years old, if not earlier. And so it's a long-running story with multiple steps, and it basically has to do with the topic of rape. When I was an undergraduate in college, I was a rape counselor, and I received all kinds of training that I very sincerely believed in. And one of those principles is that you should always believe the person who is saying they were a victim, right? That it was a principle that was, I would say, a fundamental one in the community that I worked in, the community that counseled mostly women who came to tell us about their experiences, and we would help to get services. And the idea was the number one tenet is you always believe the victim. You don't doubt that what they say happened is what happened. And so I'm starting from that place as the fundamental belief. I came to law school a few years later, and I remember saying to my criminal law professor, "Oh wow, the field of criminal defense seems so interesting, and I would love to work in criminal law, but I just know I could never be a criminal defense attorney." And when she said, "Well, why is that?" I said, "Well, because you would have to, if you were, like, say, a public defender, like she had been, you would have to defend people accused of rape. And one of the things that I believe is that you should always believe the accuser. And so it doesn't make sense for me to be in that kind of job." And I became a prosecutor for this reason, that I became a prosecutor who wanted to prosecute people who were accused of committing violence against women, whether it was sexual violence or domestic violence. And that is why I went to the DA's office in Manhattan to do that work. And in the course of that work is where my changing of the mind came. I didn't change my mind to think you should always disbelieve anyone. Rather, maybe it's difficult for you to understand how fundamental principle this was for me as a young person and a feminist working in the field of rape counseling and an activist in that feminist community. But the idea that you would listen to people tell the facts of a story, and that sometimes you wouldn't quite believe that that is what happened. I know that to a lawyer, that's just absolutely, that's just taken for granted, that the reason you have investigations and trials and arguments is to arrive at some notion of what happened, but this was really at the time anathema to me. And I realized, even in the position of a prosecutor, where I was ostensibly supposed to be in some way helping victims, I realized along the way that sometimes it was not like that I did not actually believe the one side of the story that I thought I was supposed to believe. And in fact, I became more open to the idea that even as a prosecutor, my job as a lawyer charged with safeguarding fundamental principles of fairness and due process and the search for the truth was not to start out believing anyone. And that is that was a big moment in my legal career. And when I came on this faculty to do teaching and writing on criminal law, and I've also published on rape law, and some of you may know, in recent years, I've published a lot on not just sexual assault, but also sexual assault in the campus context. And I've advocated for fair process that is not tilted toward the responsibility in favor of the accused, but rather neutral and fair in a way that allows for fair treatment and fair procedures for both sides. I know that doesn't sound very radical, but that, for me, in my personal journey, it really was. And I also know from my experience as a teacher that lots of people enrolled in law school are going through similar things. I also remembered that when I had this memory of being in Larry Tribe's class in advanced constitutional law in the fall of 2001, when September 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks occurred. And I remember sitting there, and Larry actually decided to open up the class. You may not remember, but you opened up the class to a discussion, just kind of abandoning the agenda for that day. And I remember a range of perspectives were expressed, and not that many of them were focused on due process for people who might be accused of this particular terrorist attack or terrorist attacks elsewhere or in the future. A fair number of the perspectives, understandably, were angry, scared, really literally terrified about what would happen. And I remember perspectives ranging from, we should go and bomb immediately. We should go and arrest people who are even remotely suspicious. And we should go, I remember perspectives like that. And I remember Larry, I don't want to quote you at this distance of time, but I remember Larry saying, well, we're here, we're lawyers here. This is not, that's not really the response that we as lawyers in this community have. And I feel that right now, we're in a similar moment, like after 9/11, with respect to people accused of rape and of sexual assault and harassment. That like terrorists after 9/11, rapists, people who are accused of such crimes are kind of untouchable people, and that it has implications for what we are, what we believe in as lawyers, to be able to say, I would never defend such a person, just like I said right when I was in law school. And I do think that there's something very important. In college, I certainly would have been one of the undergraduates right now who are objecting to Ron Sullivan's representation of Harvey Weinstein. There's no question in my mind that I would have been one of the ones out there saying he should resign from whatever position the university has, including even being a teacher. And I really, at this point, believe that it is not just important for lawyers to be open to finding out the truth. I actually believe it's even more important for lawyers to stand up for people who are untouchable because they are pariahs in society.
Well, thank you. So much put on the table there. I find myself wondering, when we talk about changing our minds, the first pass on that is like, I used to believe Proposition X, and now I either no longer believe Proposition X, or I've gone so far as to believe Proposition not X. But I find maybe your story is a story not of changing your mind, but of changing your perspective. And you've invoked the perspective of the lawyer. And I'm curious if you think the lawyer's perspective is something to have 24/7. Mm-hmm. In this case, to be a citizen is to aspire to that perspective. Or is it something that is a role to be played in a portfolio of roles? I could see somebody saying, in fact, maybe I believe, I don't know, that what we ask of a counselor or a friend hearing somebody say something is different than what we would instruct a prosecutor or a jury or somebody in a different role. So how much of this is about
roles?
Yeah.
So a lot of it is about roles, and I understand the way that I framed it up as, having come to law school and therefore I changed my mind. But it's not, because I fully understand that there are people who are excellent members of the legal profession, excellent law students who, with full integrity, who may believe that they themselves, while upholding their duty to the rule of law and to the Constitution, they themselves would not take on certain types of representation. I think right before this session, Larry and I talked about what kinds of clients would we not take on, and certainly many lawyers, probably most, have some. So this isn't the idea that what it means to be a lawyer is that you must be prepared to represent anyone, no matter who they are and what they are accused of doing. But it is, so I do think this is not so much, not only a change of role, which it certainly is, but even within that role, there is a genuine changing of the mind about what I, with the set of beliefs that I have, would be prepared to do and that I believe in. So it's intermixed with the change in perspective due to role, but there's also a substantive commitment.
I am also struck by, within the 4 stories we've heard, none has neatly fit into the category that we normally, among scholars, think of as the way scholarship works, therefore humanities knowledge progresses, which is you write that paper and then other people read it and they're like, that paper has a good point. Now I believe the things in that paper. But rather, these are stories, maybe not all of them, but largely about personal experience and reflection and primary research, rather than necessarily so much about scholarly dialogue resulting in something. I don't know, is there anything that anybody in the panel wants to ask anybody else in the panel before we open it up?
Too much food for thought.
Our cups runneth over.
Yeah.
So then we have to pivot from my...
I mean,
please.
We shouldn't take time with this, I think, but I'd be curious someday to know what are the changes of mind that people went through in deciding which change of mind to describe, because we've all changed our minds about a lot of things.
How many did you go through before this panel, Larry?
3 or 4.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious, because some of us change our minds more often than others, I think. And how you decide which mind change.
Well, now that you've put it on the table, I don't see any way not to actually ask. Like, Jill, how did you decide what to talk about today?
Oh, I was just trying to find something that vaguely involved the law.
Fair enough.
But
there was a trial.
But I'm struck by what you say about the interiority of the experience. And I do think that is what we all share these stories, which is we're arguing against ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? And that is a work that we all are required to do. Right? You need to kind of think through. I would also say, I had the same baking cookies. That was my exact experience. Except I didn't think about it as clearly as you did.
You went through you went both to the Turn and the river?
I used to make brownies for my undergraduates all the time, and then I realized they treated me really differently. And so I stopped making brownies for years and years and years and years and years.
And then?
I think I realized actually, honestly, like it was external for me. I figured, like, I no longer really care whether they like my brownies. It's okay to give them brownies again. And I know
I love it. I don't care what they think. Here's some brownies. I made them just for you.
With the particular kind of need for parenting, I was a more experienced caregiver to know where to set those boundaries. Like, it was about my own uncertainty about what those relationships would look like outside the classroom.
I went through a bunch of mind changes. I also think it's I feel like it was difficult to think of what counted as big enough to share on this stage, right? Again, not everyone's mind changes are announced very publicly in the New York Times. I changed my mind on what I wanted for lunch, but there's no real interesting story to that. So I think I wanted to settle on something where I felt like I could really try to explain what was going on in a way that would be useful or at least thought-provoking or interesting to others, rather than sort of I read some more case law and I changed my mind on the statutory interpretation. That's not, to me that feels less interesting.
Yes. Even though if, say, the Supreme Court were to do that,
Yeah.
that could be big.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jeannie, I don't know if you had.
So I also went through a number of things, but I settled on the one that I thought of as the most important for me because it was the most long-standing in terms of the journey. Like the arc was like Larry's. It was a long arc in which I changed my mind, and even though there was no eureka moment, there was no one moment, it was a series of moments. It is one that I, even today, find myself grappling with in terms of the different iterations of the consequences of that change of mind.
And of course, it's such a sensitive topic. To share it in the context of having changed your mind seems to me a way to an audience of saying, you know, you might well disagree or likely to disagree with me, but I was where you were once in a way that maybe, I don't know, forges a connection. Although often people who exit one intellectual camp and move to another are pariahs to the original camp.
Right. And it is not there was nothing inevitable, I think, about that journey. I think it was very contingent on the places I chose to go and the kinds of things that happened when I went there.
I think we should open it up to reactions and comments. We have a microphone in the back. Just pause for a moment. Jess Feld.
Thank you. I teach with Kendra in the cyber law clinic, and in the clinical context, we spend a lot of time with students who are learning new things and having to change their minds and dealing with the discomfort of that experience. So this panel was incredibly useful to me. I'm wondering if any of the panelists could talk a little bit about reactions you got from other people, whether there were folks who were disappointed in or angered by the changes in mind that you had, and how you dealt with that. Because I think that's a question that's very relevant to our students, like especially early on when you're having these, people fear sometimes changing their mind or being public about changing their mind because they fear the sort of social repercussions.
The price of changing your mind, which somehow might be higher than the price of having the position you changed to all along.
I think that's right.
Yeah, thoughts on this?
Well,
Larry, you made a new friend in Charlton Heston.
Yeah, it wasn't my first choice, but no, each of the mind changes, I mean, there are a lot of mind changes I've gone through that people may not know about, but each of the ones that became at all public ended up costing me a lot. Lots of my friends thought that I had really lost my mind and not just changed it, really saw me as betraying them. I mean, since I've been very much a part of the gun control movement, lots of people said, why do you have to say that? I mean, even if you believe it, can't you suppress it? And I typically don't suppress what I think, even if I think it may backfire in terms of things I want to do. And that really relates to John's question earlier about suppressing truth. And I was glad to hear Jill's answer because it wasn't a matter of suppressing truth. But impeachment is another example. I mean, I started out really gung-ho thinking from the moment that Trump was elected that he should be impeached because he was violating the emoluments clauses and yada, yada, yada. And it was in the course of writing a book about impeachment and thinking it through and asking what the consequences would be. It was really an introspective process more than anything else. And when I wrote a book with a former student of mine, Joshua Matz, just a terrific lawyer now, when I wrote a book with him that disappointed lots of people who couldn't imagine why one would be cautious or hesitant about starting up the impeachment engine right away, regardless of what might happen in the Senate, lots of pushback. I mean, various people said, oh, it's nice that it's such a measured book, but I don't really get off on being described as measured. What I enjoy is taking a position that I believe passionately, and it's hard to be passionate about moderation.
What's the title of the book?
It's called To End a Presidency, The Power of Impeachment. And it's coming out tomorrow in paperback, but the book itself has been out for a
Good
while.
sponsored link right here, right now. But interestingly, the title is not an imperative. It's not impeach, exclamation point.
No, I mean, there are, Elizabeth Holtzman has written a book about the case for impeaching him. Alan Dershowitz has written the case against impeaching. I think both are kind of premature and a little shallow, and the thing to do.
And you believe that passionately.
I do, yeah.
Uh-huh. And a quick question back to you, Larry. Do you, you've got a big platform on Twitter. I don't know, how many followers do you have now?
480,000, something like that.
Okay, 500,000 followers. Do you distinguish when you tweet or retweet between things that are, quote, in your wheelhouse, stuff that you have deep scholarly background with, and stuff that you just believe the way all of us have beliefs about what we read in the Sunday paper?
I do. I mean, I try to speak in a kind of, I know what I'm talking about voice when it's in my wheelhouse. Other times I just say, look at this curious, interesting thing in cosmology, or if this were true X, Y, or Z. And Elizabeth always tells me I should stay in my wheelhouse because, but it's a pastime. I enjoy it.
Other thoughts on the social costs of changing one's mind?
Can I just jump in to say this?
Yeah.
I mean, I assume that one of the motivations, you could tell me differently, that one of the motivations for this series of conversations is we live in an age of very high ideological purity, I mean, which Sorgini's comments speak to, and that it becomes really important, really, I think, quite imperative to when taking a public position, to address sympathetically opposing positions, even if they might be your own, and that's a way to own the possibility of a range of views. You know, in my field of American history, Ellen Brinkley, a very distinguished historian, wrote an essay, I think in the 80s, called The Problem of Conservatism in American History, in which he said, like, American historians are basically liberals and have paid no attention to conservative thought, and really don't understand it, didn't anticipate the rise of the new right, don't understand the conservative prominence in American political culture, and have really no tools and no evidence and no analysis and no methods. And this is the consequence of never changing your mind, because it was a consequence of never engaging with conservative thought. So just the reason I chose this story was actually sort of about, like, I really made a priority of making sure that I was taking conservative thought on its own terms at every point and trying to tell a huge history, because the social consequence is only speaking to people who already agree with you.
And that ended up being reflected, I think, in a lot of reaction to the work, saying how much it was trying on different points of view or addressing. Agree.
I have some thoughts on that too. On this question of ideological purity, I think that there is, when you think about changing your mind, you have an image of someone going from one camp to another camp. And it's actually that which I have, I think, tried really hard to not embrace, that image of you go from one camp to another. And I'll just give you the example of feminism, like the label. There's a lot today that is not so much about changing your mind or having positions that are deeply reflected, but rather signaling to others that you are in one camp or another camp because of the views that you have. And I would say feminism as a label. I think some people might wonder about me, why does she insist on calling herself a feminist? Just admit that she's not and go over to the other side. And I do insist on calling myself a feminist because that is where my beliefs and my motivation come from, including the ones that I have when I am, in my legal practice. I have defended people who are, provided legal representation to people, men and women, who have been accused of sexual assault and harassment. And I do it as a feminist. And I think that the whole idea of the camps and the changing of mind, I think I'm so glad that you brought this up, all of you, because one of the things that I've changed my mind on is the efficacy of thinking about things that way. Larry, I think you said it's hard to be passionate about moderation, but I would say, as hard as it might be, it is important to be passionate about moderation, and it is one of the things that I hold to as something that I would want to instill in students.
I mean, I was passionate about mathematics for a very long time. I still think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever encountered. And it's also the least ideological. not, you know.
All the history science people in the room are like, we need to talk to you
I know.
about
Look, I've read Kuhn and Lakatos and everything. No, but I really, I'm a Platonist to some extent. I really think e to the I pi equals -1, period.
Can I just respond to Jess's question? I also think that part of why it can be so difficult to engage with folks who are sort of in the other camp can be because we often frame changing your mind as a progress narrative, right? It's the idea that I have reached the correct conclusion and you are still in the like wrong camp, right? You are still like, you're still behind me and you eventually will come to my conclusion. And I think for me, one of the things about the baking, but also I think more broadly in other folk stories to some extent is, it's not that I think that this is the correct conclusion for everyone. This was the correct conclusion for me. It makes me more comfortable. But I don't, and so I don't think that like, I think that part of engaging with folks who haven't changed their minds is also not necessarily suggesting that merely changing your mind is progression to the correct goal, right? And so like that, you know, I do think like being engaged and thoughtful is, but like just because you held one opinion, or I've held one opinion and I held a different one, doesn't mean that necessarily I am I am correct now. And I think that that's a really important thing to sort of take into account when you're engaging with folks who aren't on the same page with you.
Jeannie.
I think that is right. That is certainly right. And yet, for all of us as academics and intellectuals who are in a pursuit for our views and beliefs about the world that we hope will be more correct over time. We don't want to move to a view that's not as correct as the one we had before. There is inevitably a progress narrative for each of us, although you're saying it's not the same narrative for everyone. And that, of course, is true. But I think that there is something that we would be papering over if we didn't acknowledge that the whole idea of changing your mind, the reason it's important is because each person is on a search for the truth or for something that is more true than what came before. And that is just an inevitable part of thinking that about the relevance of changing one's mind. Why are we even having this conversation? It's not just because it's interesting to have, you know, one view at one time and one view at another time.
The way to reconcile the two might be to see that if you ended up flipping your view back to where it originally was, it's not as if all the forward movement, if that's a fair term to use, is erased. It's that you've achieved yet another layer to get back to the place you were.
But one question.
We're about to conclude that the true friends were the journey along the way.
For Jeannie, would you like to see yourself as someone whose curve of mind changing becomes less and less over time? That is, that you are coming
asymptotically converging to the truth.
View.
Yes.
Or would you think you were growing more if, in fact, the sine wave the oscillations got wilder over time?
That is just so hard. That is a really hard question, as I always said in your class.
And that is a really good answer, as I always said to you.
Neither one seems to be the one I'm resonating to right now.
Right.
The sine wave, like asymptotically.
It is funny, too. You can't help but view it with a lawyer's eye of, like, where's the trap behind that question? So, other thoughts? Where has the microphone found a place? I see Howard Gardner in the back. There's one up front. The microphone is also lodged somewhere, so you will ask your question.
I was just wondering how you evaluate or resist or accommodate emotional factors, especially around credibility in the search for truth. If Hitler says that there's snow outside, that doesn't make a difference, but it seems like...
Boy, that question took a turn.
I use it to illustrate the principle.
Godwin's law.
But because it illustrates this principle that some things, even if it's true, said by certain people, seem just so emphatically that can't be true. That everything associated with that can't be true. Or something said by certain people, maybe in your camp, seems so real because they're said by people who have such credibility, but ultimately the matter can still be viewed apart from who's talking about it. And so I'm just curious how to weigh that and to factor that in.
Yeah, good question. One borders the question of enjoying the art of someone who's proven a reprobate. But
I mean,
You answered Josh's question, not mine.
I guess I would, how law professor of mine, but or not law professor, I'm going to resist your hypo and fight it by saying I don't really think that any decision can be abstracted away from the emotional consequences or like the emotional state of that you're in. And I think that like I try not to actually like separate my decision-making process from like my emotions, because I generally find that I am less thoughtful when I do that, because you know, my emotions are always going to be informing my decisions. Our emotions always form all of our mind changing or all of our thinking, and it's much more important to be aware of them. And so I think that, you know, to the extent that the first question was sort of maybe a way to tee up the Hitler snow thing, you know, I think that it is more important. I think that like because you can never make a decision that is separate from your own emotional state or your feelings about what's going on in the world, that it is more important to be thoughtful about how you approach that and be thoughtful how someone's identity or what someone's saying might affect your own decision making, rather than try to separate that, like, you know, separate the art from the artist, or, you know, the whatever, the snow from the Hitler. Yeah, so I guess my conclusion would be that I try not to think about it that way, because I found that it doesn't help me reach better conclusions.
Can I just say, I think what's maybe missing from the question or from the discussion so far is a set of fundamental principles with which we each proceed, right? Like your feminist epistemology unifies everything that you've said, right? And my commitment to primary sources as a historian lies behind all my decision making and my evaluation of claims relative, like, not that I strip my emotion out, but like it as a fundamental principle. You have a fundamental principle of constitutional analysis where you're not interested in necessarily the originalist argument about the Second Amendment, but interested in the 14th Amendment as in its vantage, right? Like we each have principles with which we proceed that make it possible for us to change our minds, right? We're not proceeding on an ideological basis, I think, one of the distinctions.
When did you know you were a historian?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm mainly a writer. I just like to write about things that have already happened.
When did you know that you had a unifying epistemological framework through which to judge the world?
When I was first asked as a journalist to write about someone who was still alive, and I chose someone who's on his deathbed.
Fair enough.
I just learned 2 minutes ago that I had a standardized epistemological framework.
It's yours to take.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts before we hit what I imagine will be our last question from Howard Gardner? Howard Gardner, the Education School.
Yeah, I was also interested, is this on?
Yes.
In the emotional aspect, but I'm wondering, when you think about your own mind changes, did you first get a kind of a signal that you're saying something or you're thinking something that you don't believe anymore? Or was it more of a rational, deductive kind of process? And this is particularly important as we think about teaching, not so much at law school where people know they're going to learn to be a lawyer, but when we're teaching undergraduates, particularly ones who won't be prepared to think about something they've thought about for a long time as being completely wrong. So it's basically the connection between the signaling that you have yourself, if any, and then how do you deal with the signaling that presumably other people have, which makes me think, my goodness, what I thought all this time just doesn't make sense anymore.
Well, I don't know, should I?
Yeah.
I think I start feeling uncomfortable about a belief that I have assumed I held, and it's an internal discomfort. And then I ask myself, well, why am I not comfortable with it? And then I start looking around and getting external signals. I don't know if that answers your question, but it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I often find that I'm saying something, do I still believe this? And that signaling to me, the signaling when I find myself saying something, I wonder if I still believe this, isn't particularly rational. It's an uncomfort. That's
right.
people are definitely thinking about this one. And we do have a somewhat dictatorial clock. I guess my hope is that this will be first of a series. That this is, by turning out today, this is certainly a ratification and a desire for us to order more lunch next time. But just a sense that processing information is not so much a function of symbolic logic all the time. I'm reminded of, it was just brought up again recently when Marilyn Voss-Savant in Parade talked about the Monty Hall problem, which I think does avail itself of an answer. And most people don't get it right, including the many mathematicians who wrote in and told her she was wrong. Worth Googling Monty Hall problem if you have a chance, or binging it. But I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to hear from the four of you, to hear the ways in which it is not as simple as propositional logic, and to have us all reflect as teachers and learners in different modes how we might bring into the environment in which we're to be teaching and learning from one another the right mien, the right perspective through which to assert with passion that which we believe, and to be ready, should it come to it, to abandon it if we end up getting the signals from wherever they come that maybe there's a better, more fitting answer than the one we were so passionately into. So thank you again for coming out. Thank you all.
John.
We'll see you again.